Take 5. 5 questions to authors and artists. With a common question, we get a personal perspective on what shapes their views. Jeff Norton, thank you for joining us on Take 5. First question, what book inspired you to write?
I think for me it was really a lack of inspiration. It wasn't like there was one book that inspired me to become a writer. It was a sense that when I was a young reader, sort of 12, 13, a young adolescent, there wasn't a book. I really struggled to find the book that would turn me into a reader, and I eventually did find it, but I wanted to look at what was available for people today and imagine myself at that age today, a sort of young teenager, and what would be the book today that would flip me from being a reluctant reader to a lifelong reader. And that was really the inspiration, because I didn't see it out there. I didn't see the book for me that today in 2014 would flip me into being a reader. So I was looking for something that wasn't there, so I felt a kind of duty of care to create it.
So within the confines of kind of school, all those kind of books just never appealed? You just always seemed like work?
They did seem like work, and I think because they seemed like work, I wasn't a great reader, so it was a downward spiral, really. I was probably running about 18 months behind my peers in terms of reading level, and I'm competitive. I like to win at things, and it was frustrating that I wasn't winning, if you will, at reading. I couldn't find a way to win at reading. And for me, luckily, I was able to find a few books that helped me along the way. One was an interactive series called Choose Your Own Adventure, which were very popular in the 1980s. And the other one was a thriller, a very light thriller, or not light, but very thin thriller, but a thriller nonetheless. And I think that probably influenced MetaWars, because I wanted to write something that would be as addictive and as compelling as a great thriller, or what is really great about video games and television, where they really hook you in. That was a big part of my inspiration.
Was that the main problem, that there was just too many distractions with like visual medium that just had a greater impact on you and resonated?
I'm not sure if there were distractions. I think at the time the storytelling and the myth building and the world building in those medium was just better. And remember, this was a time before Harry Potter. The kind of literature I was being asked to read, I just found dull. It just wasn't as compelling, it wasn't as interesting. The character depth wasn't there, the mythology wasn't there, the story arcs weren't there. It was just being done better in video games, film and television. And those mediums have only gotten better over time, but I think in parallel, young adult literature and middle grade fiction has also gotten a lot better over time. So all of the boats have risen, and today I think it's just about finding that right book for that right reader to switch them on into reading.
Can I just backtrack, because you mentioned that one of the books that did kind of resonate was Choose Your Own Adventure. And is that quite literal? I mean, was it the fact that you already had designs and ideas of what your adventure could be, and you could actually choose it from a range rather than just be forced to have one adventure? I mean, I'm not sure what Choose Your Adventure is.
So Choose Your Own Adventure was a book series that branched, so the linear narrative branched into different stories, where you as the reader were asked to make a choice, and based on what choice you made, you would turn to a different page, and the story would continue in that vein. And the story might branch from one starting point, one inciting incident, might branch into 20, 30 different endings. And I think for me it was a couple of things. One was the chapters were incredibly short, so that I felt that I was actually good at reading. It was very digestible. So that was less about the interactivity and more about short chapters that I felt that I could be successful with. I think the interactivity was interesting because it was the rise of computer-based and then eventually console-based video games, and so this idea of having some semblance of control over what's typically a passive narrative being given to you, I think was really interesting and was very much of the time. But Choose Your Own Adventure was a bit of a fad. I mean, it sort of had its day, and then in many ways I think was A, replaced by video games, but B, probably replaced by better quality linear fiction. But it is something that people of my generation, particularly from America and Canada, have a touchstone of their childhood. It was a part of our childhood, and for me it was the thing that helped switch me on into reading. But I think part of that interactivity was also about the hook or the cliffhanger, that you would make a choice and then you would want to see what happens next. And I think good fiction, good thriller fiction does that, even if it's linear. You end the chapter and you want to see what's going to happen to your protagonist. and you get people rabid to find out what's going to happen because you really care about these characters.
Absolutely. And don't you have an ebook that allows you to also kind of choose which direction you go in?
Yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah, so I've done something called so MetaWars are the linear books, and there's 4 in that series, and it's a quartet, and it's a very self-contained quartet. With a very good ending. The ending is fantastic, and so I got approached by a startup, a group of people that wanted to create an interactive ebook from the MetaWars universe, and I didn't want to do a sequel, so we've done a prequel. It's called MetaWars Blood Nexus, and it takes that same kind of non-linear, interactive approach. It's a book that behaves like a game. So it looks and feels like a book. You read it like a book. It's prose, it's great storytelling, but every so often, you as the reader are being asked to make a choice, and it's a moral choice. It's not something like left or right. It's a moral choice about what those characters should be doing. And depending on what you choose, their fates will unfold accordingly. So choices have consequences.
That sounds great for young adults especially, which, it's almost like yourself that you were saying you got in to choose your own adventure.
Well, my hope is that it's going to be the sort of thing that a younger reader, a teenager that would rather be hanging out on their iPad is a way of getting them into reading. So this is, right now it's exclusively on the iPad, and we'll do an Android and a Kindle version eventually.
Great.
But right now it's on iOS.
Okay, I hope that happens. Is there any book that you wish you had written?
Gosh, a book that I wish I'd written. My favorite book is The Great Gatsby. I think it's Fitzgerald's masterpiece. I think it's probably the greatest American novel ever written. I would have loved to have written that. And what I love about that book is that it lives in every time period. There's a lot of books that are great, but they date. And even though it's very much about the late 1920s, it doesn't date. The sort of moral themes of that book are just as relevant, if not more relevant today than they were when he was writing it. So I would have loved to have written something like that.
Well, Jeff, I know you're a filmmaker, so I'm going to have to ask you, what do you make of the movies?
The funny thing about the Gatsby films, they're all okay. And I thought the Baz Luhrmann film came closest to capturing the essence of what Sid Fitzgerald saw, right? What he saw and then reported on. But the challenge with all those films is adapting something which is Nick Carraway's monologue, right? It's his internal thinking, and he's an unreliable narrator because he's complicit with what's going on with Daisy and Gatsby. And I think that's almost impossible to translate from literature to the big screen because fundamentally it's in his head. And yeah, there's some great set pieces and the cars and the dresses and the parties and everything looks great, but fundamentally I think Gatsby as a story lives in literature and doesn't translate well to the screen because it's so internal. It's so much about Nick Carraway's view on the world. And I think Baz Luhrmann did the best job of the adaptations, particularly in the conceit where he was being asked to write it down. So you got the sense that his observations were being authored by Nick Carraway. That's the best conceit I've seen so far, but it still doesn't quite hit it. If you look at all those films, the Redford film, the Leo film, they all miss the mark, and I think that's because it takes place in Nick Carraway's head.
So I know that you dip in and out of all kinds of mediums, and I was wondering about audiobooks. Is there a book you'd love somebody to read to you?
I have got a really my relationship with audiobooks I associate with long car journeys, and I've done a lot of audiobooks back and forth across the US from Boston to Los Angeles a number of times. But I think the prose that for me is so poetic is Margaret Atwood's prose. I think she's not only a gifted storyteller, but also a true poet in the fiction sense. She's one of the very few writers that can mix poetry and fiction. And so to hear that read aloud by a great reader, I think I haven't actually listened to anything of her works. I've read her works, but I've not listened to her work. I think it'd be great to hear that aloud.
Have you ever been reading one of her books and just almost spontaneously felt like you wanted to read it aloud?
I suppose when I read, I do hear myself reading it to myself in my head. I don't know if you find that, or if your listeners find that.
But don't you hear other accents, though?
I suppose I do. I mean, and as I said, I'm a very visual thinker, so I don't just hear it, but I see it as well. And one of the things that she's so gifted at in her writing is, not only is the construction of the language so beautiful, but it is actually very, very visual. You can absolutely see, the world that she's constructed. So I'm listening to it at the same time as I'm seeing it, and I'm experiencing it sort of in all five senses, really.
And do you think there's any content that doesn't belong between the covers of a book?
I don't think there really is. I mean, I think, I don't really believe in censorship. I think But yeah, I think there is a bright line on hate speech. That's for me probably a bright line. But in terms of fiction and in terms of storytelling, I think we are all better for exploring our humanity through stories. So I think anything should be explored. But I would probably draw the line at blatant hate speech, and that's a different thing altogether. But in terms of storytelling, I think it's about exploring the human condition, and I think everything should be explored.
I'd go along with that. And finally, in the days before print, would you have been a storyteller?
I have been a storyteller. I think I probably would have been. I mean, maybe in the days before print, I would have had other jobs to do as well. But I think so. I think there's something, I think I've taken to story. It's taken me a while to get to being a storyteller. I've done lots of other different jobs and worked in different parts of the entertainment business. But I think at my heart, there's this sense of wanting to tell a story and wanting to take people with me through storytelling. Yeah, I think I probably would have been.
Well, I'm really looking forward to more of your stories.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jeff Norton.
Thank you very much.